So, welcome, guys. And this month we're kind of doing a little bit of a two-parter. Folks voted on both common DMing mistakes and productivity tips. So we're going to kind of split it half by half. It's going to be kind of a lightning round for both topics, going through a lot of different things, talking through a bunch of different ideas, and hopefully some or most of it will prove interesting or useful. So, let's get started with the DM mistake section, which is actually um, I wound up running a bit further with it than my initial post suggested. The original way this topic was advertised was, you're probably doing ability checks wrong, which, to be clear, we're going to get that in a bit. We're certainly going to talk about some common rules mistakes, even beyond the basic. But on top of that, I figured that this would be a good time to really talk a little bit about more of the philosophy of DMing and some common blind spots that dungeon masters have, things that they miss, flaws in their reasoning or their process that often can have really outsized effects down the line, and really how those mistakes can be recognized and how they can be remedied, with the goal of running a much better and stronger game for you and your players. So let's start with the basic stuff, rules mistakes. These are just a few common things that a lot of DMs struggle with or don't remember or don't really grok. The first one being, of course, calculating challenge rating. A lot of folks kind of think it's a number pulled out of a hat. They're not sure how it works. This is a quick one. Just there are ample CR calculators online. 1on5e tools, certainly. There are others that are not, that are on more, uh, uh, less black flag sites, shall we say, that are also available. And to really understand these, you've got to understand that it's a matter of calculating averaged output, damage output over a 3-round basis, assuming all attacks hit, and so on and so forth. And so, just taking a second to look at these challenge rating calculators and seeing how they work, it's not going to take more than 30 to 45 seconds, and then using that consistently to really calculate challenge rating and go from there can help you do a little bit better when you're homebrewing monsters and figuring things out. Second thing to point out is that something I found in drafting CR 2.0 is that anytime someone is delayed in an encounter or is taken out of commission for even a single round, whether it's a player character, an NPC ally, or a monster, it has a massive outsized effect on the encounter for the simple reason that encounters are very, very sensitive in difficulty to um, just the numbers of creatures on either side. What a lot of people call action economy and what I call power. And the reason for this is that, it's a matter of both damage output and damage absorption. And if, say, your big boss is completely absent for the first round of combat, then all of the minions are going to take all of the damage that the boss otherwise would have soaked up. And vice versa, if two of your players are late to get to the combat, then the remaining players are going to soak up all the damage that those players otherwise would have taken. And on the opposite side, the enemies on the other side are now not taking any of the damage that those two players would have contributed, which makes them last even longer. And you wind up seeing these kind of death sprawl situations where even just a single round of delay in a combat that could be as short as 4, even 3 rounds can have a massive effect, swinging the scales in one direction or another. So you've got to be careful. Third point, just real quick, this was on Reddit today. I figured I'd toss it in. Dark vision and darkness. Just remember that dark vision is not I see in darkness perfectly. It's you treat darkness as dim light, which means that if you've got dark vision in a dark cavern, you're rolling with disadvantage on all of your perception checks. Players, it's like invisibility, right? Players complain a lot about, like, I'm invisible, I have dark vision, I should be able to succeed automatically, and the answer is no. Having dark vision is what lets you attempt to see in darkness, just like having invisibility is what lets you attempt to hide in plain sight. You're still, in the sake of dark vision, rolling with disadvantage, just like anyone would in dim light. Uh, Estimating AoE, that should say damage, not estimating AoE darkness. But there are rules in the DMG. This goes back to the calculating CR point. There are rules in the DMG that let you estimate how much average damage an AoE effect, like a fireball spell, for example, will actually do. It's not impossible to calculate the CR of, for example, a spellcaster. What you need to do is go to the DMG, figure out what that average damage is going to be. For example, fireball is a radius of 20. So you divide the radius by 5, which is 4, and that's how many monsters the spell is going to deal damage to. And then you just multiply the damage per monster by the average number of monsters. That's how you calculate the damage of an AoE. More to the point of the original title of this workshop, again, before we get into the juicy stuff, going past the rules, group checks, remember, most people I think are aware that, if the group or a whole succeeds or fails together, all you need is a group check, which means that just half of them need to pass the DC. So if you've got a whole party stealthing past a guard patrol, just half of them need to pass, not all of them, as per the rules. And for repeated checks, you have situations where a barbarian says, "Oh, I want to break down the door," and then they fail. And someone else says, "But I want to break down the door," and they succeed. And maybe the wizard does it where the barbarian failed. And players don't like this. Because the barbarian's like, "I'm the barbarian, I should be the one breaking doors down. Why arbitrarily can I only try it once, but someone else can jump in and get it right the second time?" And the answer to that is, well, that's actually not how it's supposed to work. Rules as written, you should never ask for an ability check if there's no penalty for failure and there's no time crunch. For example, if a barbarian's trying to break down a door and like they have all the time in the world to do so, and it's technically possible for them to do it if they roll a natural 20, according to the rules, you let them automatically succeed if they take 10 times as long as a single attempt would make. So if they attempt to break it down, if they can attempt a single time in one round, it just takes them 10 rounds to do it automatically. They don't even have to roll, though you can let them roll if you want to see how long it would take or with how much flair or aplomb they do it. The rules as written, once the barbarian says, "I want to break down the door," if there's no time crunch and no penalty for failure, they break down the door. There's no debate. The wizard never gets to try. And you can look more at the module or at I think it's the player's handbook for more information about the nitty gritty of how this works. For example, if there are penalties for failure, like say if you persuade the guard, if you try to persuade a guard and he decides that he thinks that you're lying or you're up to no good, then obviously he now mistrusts you and there's a consequence for failure. Or similarly, if it's in the heat of battle and the barbarian tries to break down the door and fails, and then the wizard gets it right on the same round on a later turn, then it makes a little more sense that the barbarian was, weakening it a little bit for the wizard to try, and maybe the conditions were slightly different. Final note, perception versus investigation. I shouldn't have to say this, but everyone should know at this point. Perception is when you're trying to look at something that is in clear view, if your senses are strong enough, and investigation is any time you're looking at something that is not in clear view. Like, say, a trap mechanism. Oh, and of course, as always, feel free to jump in and interrupt with questions or comments or thoughts or anecdotes or what have you as I go. I'm going pretty quickly at this point, but glad to hear any thoughts that you have as well as we go along. So, we're out of the rules stuff and now into the more interesting material, I think, which are some design mistakes that a lot of DMs tend to make. And you've probably seen some of my philosophy here in the campaign advice channel, discussing some of these topics before. By far, the biggest mistake that I see a lot of DMs make is that they tend to use top-down design instead of bottom-up design. What does this mean? So, in game development terms, and specifically in the context of Magic the Gathering, which is where I learned it from, top-down design means you start with an aesthetic, fleshed-out idea. Think of it as deciding what your story is going to be about. It's about a dragon that kidnaps a princess. It's about a kingdom at war, right? That's top-down design. And then you decide what your story is going to be, and then from that story, you figure out and flesh out the mechanics of how it actually fits together. For example, in Magic the Gathering, an example of a top-down design is the set of Innistrad, where the design team said, this is going to be gothic horror, vampire, werewolves, ghosts, the set. Now, how do we actually implement that using mechanical concepts? And then they made a whole bunch of design decisions down the line. That's top-down. By contrast, bottom-up design is where you start with mechanical ideas first. How do the pieces and cogs fit together? And then from there, you slowly build it up, scaffolding it over time, and kind of put a kind of a facade, a visage, a colorful skin over that mechanical scaffold you've built that actually ensures that the functional thing that you've built is now engaging and attractive to your players. If you're a writer, you might have heard the terms gardening versus architecting, which is kind of a similar process. When you're a gardener, you have these big ideas of the story and you let it guide you and navigate. And once you've got these colorful, rich story ideas down on page, then you're like, oh, none of this makes sense. Let's go back and try to tend to it, weed the garden, take out the bits that don't work, move things around, replant them, and eventually it'll be sensible. The problem with gardening in D&D is that the revisions, it does provide for much richer and much more vivid and enchanting ideas, but it's a much slower, more grueling process. By contrast, the architecting model, which writers like Brandon Sanderson use, for example, in contrast to gardening, which is George R. R. Martin, architects again figure out the mechanics first. What are the acts of this story? What are its dramatic beats? What are its emotional themes? How do I want these characters to develop? How do I keep my audience engaged? And then they slowly build up that outline scaffold, those mechanics, and then they figure out how to put all the dressing on top to make it look good afterwards. This can be a little disappointing for some folks who really like the artistry of it, and they can feel a little forced at times, a little soulless and spiritless, but it can be a lot quicker for getting something functional in front of your players, and it's very, very useful as a strategy if you're very confident that you can fill in that gardening creativity at the table through improvisation. Because if there's one thing that's true for me personally, I find it very easy to flesh out colorful things, be creative, let loose, and let those juices flow at the table. But I find it very difficult to keep that mechanical structure in my head and process and create it while I'm actually DMing the game live. So, kind of taking advantage of those different spheres can be very helpful. And kind of as a corollary of this, and you've probably heard me talk about Watsonian versus Doyleist reasoning at this point, um, but a the concept of Watsonian versus Doyleist is another way of saying out of game reasoning versus in game reasoning. For example, the example I like to use is, let's say in Sherlock Holmes, because this idea comes from, John Watson and Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the series. Let's say Sherlock Holmes decides in one of the stories to go inside a restaurant. From an in-world perspective, from a Watsonian perspective, if you ask John Watson, he would say, well, he went into the restaurant because he was hungry. But if you have asked Arthur Conan Doyle, he would say he went into the restaurant because I wanted him to be in the restaurant because that's where the next crime happens, and I wanted him to be an eyewitness. That's the difference between Watsonian and Doyleist reasoning. In-world versus intentional out-of-world reasoning. Watsonian asks, what makes sense in the world? Doyleist says, that's ridiculous. There is no world. It's made up. It's imaginary. It does whatever I want. It does whatever I tell it to do. So I'm going to decide first what I want the world to achieve, and then out of game, out of world in terms of my audience, and then from there, I'm going to change and warp and manipulate the world to make sure that it's consistent and that it does exactly what I want it to do. Sherlock Holmes is not real. He is my creation, my puppet, and he does what I tell him. That's Doyleist reasoning. And applying that to D&D means, instead of thinking, what makes sense for this NPC, think, what effect do I want this NPC to have? How do I want my players to feel about them? How do I want my players to interact with them? What impact do I want them to have on the story? Ask those Doyleist questions first before you ever think of asking a question like, well, what would this NPC do? Because by defining your goals out of game first, you're able to be much more deliberate and intentional and a lot more effective in ensuring that whatever world you create is one that's maximally primed to entertain and engage your players. Because at the end of the day, verisimilitude and immersion are important, but they're also oversold. It's a lot easier to turn a detail that accomplishes your goals that is slightly disjuncted from the world into one that enmeshes with the world than the opposite direction. It's a lot easier to come up with excuses for why something doesn't seem to make sense at first glance than to make something that makes sense but doesn't serve your purposes actually serve those purposes. Similarly, a lot of the time I see people start from implementation instead of goals. They're like, oh, how should I make this combat encounter work? What should these monsters do in this context? How should this villain act? And the question that you should always ask as a corollary of this is, well, what is my intention here? What kind of experience am I trying to create for my players? Once you know that, everything else cascades into place. As a kind of a jumping off point from that, I see a lot of DMs who they're stuck very much in their own internal worlds, and we've talked about this in the Discord before. But one of the big mistakes I see them make is not asking players for their plans and their goals. After every session, after every arc, ask them, what are you enjoying? What do you want to see more of? But more importantly than just getting feedback is, what do you plan to do? What does your character plan to do? What are your intentions? What should I prepare, in other words? Because I see a lot of DMs who get completely thrown off because their players, they prepare all of this material, all of this content, and then their players, in the first 5 minutes, decide to go gallivanting off in a random direction instead. And part of this can be attributed to the DM not entirely doing well in designing their scenes, which we'll talk about in a second. But more importantly than that, DMing should not be a guessing game. It's okay to ask your players what they're intending to do. That doesn't spoil the magic. It doesn't ruin the fun. It makes your job much easier because now you can actually process and create what they're doing. Imagine if in a video game, uh, video games, they only render the things that you're looking at. So if I'm not going toward a certain area, it's not going to load it into the game. Imagine a video game that just kind of guessed where you were going next. And so it was entirely possible for you to walk into an area that was just blank gray and not actually any textures or locations or NPCs. Would you enjoy that? Probably not. Ask your players where they're going and then factor that into how you prep. And finally, on a more kind of implicit level, on the design mistakes area, though it's not really commonly said, because a lot of players are very bad at kind of enunciating and expressing their kind of internal desires, DMs still need to be able to really dig that out for themselves, or at least predict it. Because a lot of the time, I see a lot of DMs really think to themselves, oh, what would I enjoy if this were a book that I were reading or a book that I were writing? And they have all these big, twists in mind, these dark, harrowing challenges, and they think, I have a lot of fun running and prepping this. It's going to be great for my game. But as a DM, your role is fundamentally distinct from that of the player. You are not a player. What you find fun is respectfully, not what your players find fun necessarily. What you find to be a harrowing, fun, trial-filled challenge, your players might find unfun because it's grueling, it's frustrating, it's confusing, or just doesn't let them feel powerful. As the DM, your job is to create adversity and challenges that your players want and enjoy, not things that you find entertaining or enriching. And so you've really, while D&D is of course a game for you as well, and you've got to be able to have fun with it, there's a limit. It's your responsibility to make sure that the content you're creating is something that your players will enjoy, not just you.
I think that's an easy pitfall to fall into, especially if you start getting into like your big bad's mindset and you're like, well, of course he would do these extremely unfair things, right? But then it translates into very unfun game time. Um, like yes, maybe your super evil wizard would do some cruel dungeon they have to go through that is just absolutely unfun to march through, and your players are going to have a good time. And it's like, well, maybe you should suspend some of the that story idea to figure out mechanically how to make it fun, and then go from there.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
I've definitely fallen into that pitfall before and had to kind of back up and be like, okay, well, maybe he can be less evil.
Yeah, definitely. And that even goes to the Watsonian versus Doyleist. Like, it might make sense for a character to do something, and you might be really invested in this idea of the story you've built up in your head. But I think I've mentioned this in previous workshops. Your expectations for the story are not real. You might have built up all this intricate lore and expectations and future storyline and villain backstory in your head. None of it exists. All that matters is, as the screenwriting industry puts it, what's on the screen, what your players have already seen. You can and should be willing to change all of your plans, all of your expectations on a dime, throwing anything away the second it ceases to be useful for player enjoyment and entertainment. And just because of that, you've also got to be aware of the things that go into it. And then beyond that, you've even got to, if you want to be really good at it, you've got to kind of delve deeper and think, actively solicit places not only where your players can avoid, being frustrated, but also find opportunities and manufacture opportunities to make them shine. Something like, something as simple as adding in a bunch of archers so that your monk can use deflect missiles is an example of this. Players want to use their abilities. They don't want to have them shut down. And so that kind of perspective, I think, can be really helpful in making sure that your players get the most out of the game possible. I see some questions going in the chat. I'll answer them as they come up, but I'm going to keep moving along in the meantime. So, some mistakes that I see people make in gameplay when they're running the game, or at least prepping the game as well. I guess holding off a little bit. Assuming player actions is a really common. I've seen myself doing it, where you'll assume that players will act in a certain way or respond in a certain respect. Obviously they'll take this quest. Obviously they'll investigate this clue by going over here. Obviously they'll understand this. And there's a real problem where, because of these assumptions that we make, our prep is not robust. To put it another way, whenever you prep something that absolutely has to happen, you've really got to put a lot of work into it to make sure that it's resilient, to make sure that you are directing it in the way necessary by not assuming that the players will act in a certain way, or at least doing your best to divert them in certain directions. For example, in the original Twice Bitten Black Carriage scene, where Strahd shows up and tries to charm a bunch of player characters by looking in their eyes, that worked in the original really well because the other players, who were DMs themselves and wanted to see how far they could push it, defied Ismark's instructions not to look Strahd in the eyes, and as a result, got charmed and hypnotized. But I can't assume that they're going to do that. This is why I wound up deleting that encounter and entirely revising it, because you can't assume that your players will look in Strahd's eyes. And so the question then becomes, if they're not going to do that, what's this scene about? And if you can't answer that question, that means that your prep is not robust. You're assuming player actions. And consequently, you've really got to make sure that when you're prepping and organizing your ideas, you're really understanding player incentives, why they do what they do, both in a general sense, players everywhere, and your particular players. For example, my players in Twice Bitten were very incentivized to stir up controversy, to make mistakes in character, to do things that might not have made sense but were emotionally satisfying. And in that case, sure, I could reasonably rely on them looking into Strahd's eyes, at least in a few cases. But that's not going to be true for all parties. You know, some players are motivated very much by loot, by achievement, by combat, by praise, by socializing, by a whole number of things. And really understanding what drives and motivates your players is incredibly important for building those resilient, robust scenes. It's no use putting a princess in the tower if all of these players have a moral objection to feudalism in the first place. They're not going to save the princess. The unrelated note on gameplay, I see a lot of situations where DMs wind up running scenes that don't have clear dramatic questions. And we've talked about these, I'm not going to go into them, but if ever you've seen a scene that kind of lies flat on the table and no one's really sure what to do, there's probably not a clear dramatic question involved. The players have not been prompted. They don't really know where to go, what to do. Maybe you've expressed the tension and the stakes and given them a goal, but they have no obvious tools for actually doing something. You've told them, oh, get into the fortress, but there are no obvious secret entrances. There are no guards to talk to. And you've got to remember that as the DM, the world exists only in your brain and it's subject entirely to your control. The players might even be reluctant to ask something like, is there a secret passage? Because you could as easily say no. You need to drop those hints. You need to drop those seeds to give your players something to grasp onto. You know, in a video game, the screen will obviously make a lot of use of visual hierarchies, of colors, of things to draw your attention to intentionally. Like, I've never seen a video game that just relied entirely on players randomly poking around until something went right. You've got to do the same as a DM. You've got to give that information. You've got to be a lot, less tight-lipped with it and kind of give those nuggets out freely for your players to grasp onto. Okay, yes, I see the point in chat about Minecraft. But Minecraft's a little different in that there's not really any higher narrative expectation. It's entirely player-created goal. So I guess if that's the kind of campaign you're running and all of your players have bought into that, then sure, forget what I just said. But I think most campaigns are not going to fall in that bucket. And then finally, one of the big things that I notice is a lot of the time, DMs fail to notice when they're confused by something. Specifically confused by a player's actions. A player says, oh, this shopkeeper isn't, giving me good prices. I want to jump over the counter and, beat him up. And, part of what a lot of people wrongfully think is a social contract of D&D is, oh, players can do anything they want. It's a game of consequences, so I should just let this happen. But I think reasonably a lot of the time, these dungeon masters are failing to notice that they're confused. Why is the player doing this? What do they hope to achieve? And so it's really important when this happens, anytime a player does something, for example, like hitting one of their compatriots with a fireball, or, casting a spell that's going to bring the whole castle crashing down on them, or murder hoboing a shopkeeper that'll almost certainly land them in jail, is pause. Notice that you're confused. Notice that the player's actions don't make sense to you. And then just ask, these are the consequences that I reasonably expect would happen from this. I thought that you'd be aware of this. Are you okay with those consequences happening, and are you aware of them at all? Clarify that confusion. Don't just assume that players can do whatever, whenever, because a lot of the time, because the world is in your head, players make assumptions, they make pitfalls, they lack judgment, and it's not really reasonable or fair to enforce consequences on players when, in good faith, they had no idea that those consequences might happen. As a quick note, jumping back, I see a good point in the chat about the 20-foot rule. It doesn't make sense to worry about something how something looks closer than 20 feet if the audience won't ever be there. Absolutely agreed. Back on the design mistakes, don't worry about something that's very far away. Focus on what's here and now, what the audience can, or rather the players can see in front of them right now, and what's going to make a real difference to their enjoyment and gameplay right now. Anything beyond that, you can have some fun, fiddling with it. If world building is your passion, go ahead. But be ready at all times to kill your darlings, no matter how hard it is. Nothing matters except what the players experience. Everything beyond that is instantly and always expendable. Final point about DM mistakes before we move on to the productivity section. Obviously, the big thing that everyone talks about is addressing OOC problems with IC solutions. In other words, if your player is antisocial and murder hoboing, instead of stopping the game and talking to them about it, trying to enforce it by sending bounty hunters after them, or if your player is being very antisocial and refusing to interact with the rest of the party, having wizard forcefully spirit them away and manacle them to the bard instead of talking to them out of game and saying, hi, please be a team player. We've all seen this. We've all talked about it. Beyond that, though, I think that's kind of a symptom of a larger problem, which is a refusal to break the fourth wall. We've talked about this in past workshops, but I really just want to emphasize it here, which is that D&D as a game, it's an artifice. It's, obviously immersion is important, but you should never let immersion compromise the experience of the game itself. If there's an emotional character moment you want to happen, talk to your players about it. If you did something wrong or you think something could have been improved, talk to your players about it. If you want to know, what your players' hopes are for the upcoming arc, don't just try to guess what they want. Ask them what they want. It's okay to break that fourth wall and engage with the game as a product that you're delivering to an audience instead of some kind of mystical, creative curtain that must never be broken. Two other things specifically regarding addressing problems. Things that the DM very often is kind of tasked or positioned as someone being a negotiator or a mediator. These two players are fighting, you need to step in and help it out. Or, one of the players is being disrespectful of you and your time. How do you deal with that? Something like that. A big issue in a lot of these problems, and I'll probably eventually do a workshop about this later on. I'm certainly planning on addressing it in Dungeon Mentor eventually. Is that a lot of people wrongfully assume that mediation and negotiation should be positional, where someone takes out a position, someone else takes out another position, and then they try to compromise and meet in the middle. That's not the right way to do compromise. What you need to do is really interrogate the difference. Ask questions, meaningful questions, to really discern the interests underlying the positions that someone has taken. If someone is coming to their D&D session late all the time, and they want to make sure that they can do that, ask them why. Why is that important to you? Not in a challenging way, not in a way to inquisitorial, but to genuinely understand where they're coming from. Figure out why they're being late, or figure out why they feel a need to talk out of turn, or why they feel a need to roll dice all the time. And then use active listening in turn to show that you understand it. Reflect back what they said onto them and check to make sure you got it right. Oh, so if I got it right, you're late a lot of the time because, you've got a really busy job and you don't get to control your hours. You'd love to be here, but you can't actually afford to because, your boss would probably fire you if you left early. Is that right? And then they say, yeah, that's it. Or they say no, and you go even further. And then in response, you share your interests. You say, okay, I get that. But in my position, when you come late to it, it can be very disruptive for me. I put a lot of time into assuming that everyone's going to be there. And when not everyone's here, it can feel kind of awkward. And I don't really, enjoy running sessions like that. And, it can also make a lot of my prep spin out of control, especially if I prepare something specially for you. It can be disappointing. And now that you've really zeroed into the core interests and really emotions and values underlying these different positions, you're in a much better position to creatively work together and come up with solutions that can address these and figure out how to reconcile them in a way that makes everyone better off. As a corollary to that, though, sometimes, these interests are not reconcilable. I've seen situations where a player is really disruptive and rude and harmful to the mental health of the other players, but DMs and the groups are really reluctant to break it off because, maybe some of the players really like that disruptive player, or maybe that player is hosting them at their house, and if that player, got kicked out of the group or got angry, then there would be nowhere else to play. The idea of a BATNA, or a best alternative to a negotiated agreement, is really critical in these spaces, where, if we're not able to come to an agreement, what's my alternative? And a lot of the time, by knowing what that BATNA is, you can really understand, look, if I try, to approach this person, but I don't have a meaningful BATNA, then I have no way of getting what I want than, trying to rhetorically persuade them. And, by contrast, if you've got a really great BATNA, like you put in a lot of time to like really develop it, to, talk to your players, figure out who feels what about this person, try to come to accommodations, try to recruit new players affirmatively in case spots open up, find another place to go. That lets you approach that mediation, that negotiation, with a lot more confidence and strength because now you have an alternative to fall back on. You know, this alternative, doesn't need to be preferential to getting what you want. It's totally fine to, you know, approach that negotiation in good faith and genuinely try to resolve the problem. But if you've got that good BATNA, there's no shame in if you can't work it out. If the other person is acting in bad faith or being intransigent, then just there's no shame with just walking away and taking that alternative that you've worked to find for yourself. Because you can do that. You have, a lot of people feel stuck in place, but, you should feel empowered to go out and find those alternatives. And if they don't already exist, create them. Do a little bit of extra legwork. It can be frustrating sometimes. I know that, certainly you can, try to do a little bit of brainstorming to figure out what your alternatives are, but life is big and really strange. There's a lot more than one way to do something or to make something work. So it never hurts to try to figure out what some alternatives might be. So that's all I've got for the DMing mistakes. Does anyone have any final thoughts, comments, or questions before we go into the productivity bits?
Nope.
Cool. All right, and oh, I see someone's typing in the chat, but I'll let them pop in if they want to. Otherwise, we'll get started with the next section. All right, we can come back to stuff later as well if people want to drop things in the chat. Okay, so that is the DMing mistakes bit. Let's talk a little bit about productivity, both kind of my own thoughts on it, some comments on the discussions that came up in the thread, in which we were prepping topics in advance in the Discord, and going from there. And this will be a bit of a shorter section, but hopefully still enjoyable. So first, for general productivity purposes, just kind of getting stuff done in general, not necessarily D&D, I want to talk about kind of 3 different ways to conceptualize this: managing your time, managing your mental load, and managing yourself. So time management, you've probably heard about things like the Pomodoro technique, about Trello, about to-do list apps, logging everything, making schedules. I experimented with calendars for myself, blocking out hour by hour, doing kind of nightly reviews and figuring out exactly what I'm doing each minute of the next day. Some of these worked better than others. Some of them crashed and burned. Some of them worked for a little while and then stopped. There's nothing wrong with trying a lot of different ways of doing it, but I think that, ultimately underlying a lot of these needs to manage time are deeper issues of mental and emotional health. And admittedly, I might be weird in saying this, in that I'm the kind of freak show who can really get into a good project like Reloaded or Dungeon Mentor or whatever, and just kind of keep going for like 5 hours at a time. So I might be very strange. I probably am very strange. But that's not to say that this kind of idea of a flow state of kind of easy productivity is, off limits for everyone. And, a lot of it starts, I think, with this idea of mental management, of trying to really identify the thoughts that you're feeling at any given time, understanding, kind of the root of your reluctance to do something. If you're like watching videos instead of doing an assignment or some kind of task or chore, kind of asking yourself, why am I doing this or why am I not doing that? Place it into perspective. Really write it out for yourself what the consequences might be. You know, if your brain is full of thoughts, meditating on it, and not in the kind of like I'm not a very spiritual person, but more like in the sense of just, letting your thoughts go past your mind and really just kind of clearing your mind, listening to the sounds around you. There are lots of channels that can talk about this better than me. I'm not really great on this stuff. Therapy, as someone mentioned in the chat, really understanding how your brain works can be a really powerful tool once you start to interrogate, well, why don't I want to do this? Because it's not as simple as, oh, I don't want to wash the dishes because I don't want to wash the dishes. There's something else there. And part of that comes with this last piece, which I like to call self-management, which really comes down to doing a lot of experimentation and a lot of introspection to see how the experimentation works. You know, like I mentioned, you should be willing to try different things to see what works for you. But for me, something that's helped is that kind of self-interrogation to think, okay, I want to do this, but not that. Or I'm staring at a blank page and I'm not writing anything down. Why? Why am I not writing anything down right now? Why am I sitting on the couch right now, staring at my phone, or even staring up into space instead of getting up and clearing the dishwasher, for example, or folding laundry, what have you? And, you know, a lot of the time, that kind of very basic introspection can eventually lead you to some helpful places. For me, for example, I have had an issue with just kind of I don't want to call it executive dysfunction because I don't have ADHD, but you know the vibes where like you're sitting in a chair and maybe you're not entirely comfortable like but like you're not moving, you have no momentum, you don't want to. And you know, I didn't feel any urgency. I didn't feel a need to get up, so I didn't get up and I would just sit there for 5 minutes and not do anything of the chores that I needed to do. Um and I started asking myself this and noticing patterns that changed when I did things, and so I started experimenting. For example, one of the things that I found is that when I'm in that kind of staring blankly forward, browsing phone space, not doing anything, I can break myself out of it by doing something as small as nodding my head downward or, you know, wiggling some fingers, because that interruption, that pattern break, you know, doesn't even force me to do anything. It stirs me to do something differently. It breaks that lull that I've fallen into. And so, really being experimental, figuring out different parts of yourself, and just taking the time to get to know yourself uh, can be very helpful. Because ultimately, the way I see it, you shouldn't be driving yourself like, you know, a servant to, you know, kind of immediately do everything you want. If you don't want to do something, then there's some reason why. Try to figure that out. Um, you know, maybe this is coming off as a lot of hooey or woo, but, you know, your brain is a tool, but like all tools, it has its weak spots and it's got its places where it doesn't run as well, or, you know, places where it clogs up, or times when it, you know, starts running a little slow. And looking at it like that, looking at your brain as a tool or an engine that sometimes needs to be cared for in certain ways is not a bad thing. It can be very powerful. So I can't, you know, I don't want to go into too much depth on that because I've kind of rambled on enough on that point. But you know, hopefully, if nothing else, my incoherent meanderings can give some inspiration, at least spark some further thoughts about it. More to the points of D&D specific productivity. Um, as a quick note, someone asked in the Discord how to make sure that you're always taking notes in the middle of a session. You know, especially when you're like improvising the names of people and places. I've struggled with this for sure. Something I tend to do is I just always have like a little memo pad or notebook or like, you know, blank document in front of me on my computer whenever I'm running the game, so I always have something to easily write it down in. But more than that, I think something that is very helpful is taking advantage of player huddles. You know, for 5, 15, 30 seconds at a time, there are times in every game where your players are talking about something that does not involve you. Whether it's their strategy for the next turn, or it's how they should interact with a certain NPC, or what have you. And I think it can be helpful to kind of prime yourself every time this happens to just brain dump onto that document, onto that notebook, or what have you, everything that's happened and everything you've come up with, all the important, you know, who's, what's, when's, where's, how's, and etc. Because those times you can safely unplug. You don't need to be there for their internal discussion. All you need to know is what they decide to do at the end of it. And so those moments, those huddles can be really invaluable when you're trying to get a moment aside to get those notes down onto a page. And as a corollary, don't be ashamed to ask your players, you know, either in the middle of a session, at the end of one, or later, hey, what did I call that NPC? I forget. You know, especially if you've designated a player as kind of an archivist, as a note taker, or a player has chosen to do that themselves. There's no shame in, you know, deferring or delegating to that player at times when you're a little bit overloaded. They'll understand. More to the point of kind of campaign productivity and kind of we had a question, for example, about how do you really keep them organized? How do you avoid jumping into a campaign face first and kind of losing any sense of narrative cohesion or consistency because you're just going week by week? And the way I like to think about it is when I start a campaign, I want to start by defining the themes and the seeds. By themes, I mean, what is this campaign about? Is this a campaign about redemption, about loss, about hope, about horror, about survival, about humanity? What are the top level themes? What is its thesis? What does it have to say? For me, when I was thinking of revising Rime of the Frost Maiden, the theme that I eventually settled on was, above a bunch of others, was in a massive cosmic uncaring universe, the thing that gives meaning to life is the fact that we care about each other. Humanity creates its own meaning, and that was the theme that I decided to run with for it, and that informed all of my prep work after that. Similarly, seeds are those narrative elements. We've talked about them in foreshadowing contexts before, where a seed grows into a sprout, to a shoot, to a stalk, as it kind of becomes more obvious, becomes less opaque foreshadowing, plays a bigger role in the story. But at its core, a seed is a single narrative element. For example, the Keepers of the Feather are a seed. The Druids of the Svalich Woods are a seed. The Mountain Folk of Yedrag are a seed. The Amber Vestiges are a seed. Strahd von Zarovich is a seed. These narrative elements, these plot elements, will grow and develop over time. And so, at the start of a campaign, you want to jot down, even if it's just one or two words for each one, all of the seeds that you would like your campaign to feature. And you can always add more later, but just generating and brainstorming as many as you can is really helpful for getting a big picture context of how everything will connect together. And this won't take you longer than 10 minutes at most, I assure you. You can take more time to kind of really define what they are, maybe have a one-sentence description for each seed, what they want, what they're doing. But really, you don't need that much to have that sense of overarching conceptual narrative for your campaign. Because once you dive into it, as you divide your campaign up into arcs, which are, individual adventures with specific dramatic questions, such as, retrieving the bones of St. Andrel is an arc. Once at the start of each arc, you want to decide all of the seeds that you want to include in that arc and that you want to develop or progress. So, for example, when I was preparing or designing the St. Andrel's Feast quest in Reloaded, I decided I want to include and advance the seed of Strahd's Vampiric Brides. I want that plot element to play a role in this and to tie it together, and that's how I wound up including Valenta as the quote-unquote boss of the vampire spawn, instead of just having a bunch of nameless vampire spawn. And then similarly, in terms of preparing content, you only want to prepare content as and when you need it, right? So at the start of an arc, and I think I've got templates up on the DM's toolkit that help with this. At the start of an arc, figure out what that arc is going to be about at a very high level. But don't go any further. At the start of a chapter, where a chapter is a particular location or area, such as a town or a building or what have you that the players visit within an arc, plan out that chapter. What is that chapter going to include and what is it going to look like? What are the components of it? What are the major NPCs? What is the environment like, etc.? And only then, when you're sitting down to prep for a session, in which you expect those scenes to happen in this immediate session, do you actually start prepping scenes, right? So, I mean, it's entirely possible that, sometimes at the start of right before one session where they've just finished an arc, they're going to a new place, you'll have to do a bit more legwork than usual, because you'll have to design an arc, design the first chapter in that arc, and design all of the scenes that you expect to come up in that session. But once you've done that, you've got that arc skeleton, that chapter scaffolding that'll guide you through the rest of the next of the sessions that happen in those narrative divisions. And we did, as a final note on that, we did get one question, saying, how do I divvy up my prep throughout the week instead of concentrating it all in 1 or 2 days? Confession, I do that. I do almost all of my prep like the night before. I'm very guilty of this as well, and that's okay. For me, I find that for projects, I work better when I can get into that, again, flow state, going back to the general productivity, where I can really work in depth for 2, 3, 4 hours at a time. I have a lot of more creativity. I can get into a rhythm. There's a lot more integrity to the material as I'm working with it, because I can easily jump back and forth instead of having those transaction costs where I have to reacclimate myself to the material and re-dive into it every time. So it's okay to do that if that's what works for you. I mean, obviously, if you have reasons why that doesn't work out because of, your work schedule or what have you, then maybe you can look into some other means of scheduling and organizing your time and figuring out why you do that introspectively, like we talked about, to try to fix it. But it's not inherently a bad thing to do prep at the last minute. Some of my best ideas have come from doing things at the last minute, which is not to say that you shouldn't revise or edit your ideas over time, but don't feel bad if you're a classic midnight DM, as many are. Finally, just something I really, really want to drive home for D&D is that DMing is a hobby. It's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be something that you want to do. It should be addicting to prepare for and run D&D. If it's not, there's probably something going wrong. Which is not to say that there's something wrong with you, but that there might be something wrong with the process of how you're approaching it. If you're not enjoying prepping it, if you're looking at a blank page and seeing, a faceless, heart, soul-crushing cliff instead of a tapestry of possibility, there's probably a problem here. It's really worth thinking and asking yourself, why do I feel that? At some point, presumably, even if just for a single flash in a single session, you got some joy out of prepping for a session. Why aren't you getting that here? So by asking those intentional questions and being very deliberate in how you kind of taking a step back, and figuring out why it's work instead of play can really be helpful, I think, in turning something that can feel like a chore into something that's a lot more interesting and meaningful to you. So for me, for example, I was feeling very, very annoyed and bored with a particular campaign that I was running for some friends of mine. It was kind of a short, few shot thing, and it was felt like a chore. It was finding really annoying to me, and I was wondering why it felt like such a taxing chore, and I wasn't really enjoying prepping or even in some cases running the sessions. And I realized that it was because I hadn't done enough work to figure out the characters. My players weren't building meaningful characters with any NPCs. The NPCs were just vehicles for the story. And what I really loved, what was so meaningful to me, was inhabiting and embodying those characters. I didn't care about the plot, I cared about the characters. And so by figuring that out and refocusing a lot of my work around the NPCs and the player characters' personal goals, things got a lot better. Because suddenly it wasn't just about the plot, it was about something that I affirmatively enjoyed. Seeing the question in chat, going back to the sequencing, the question is, don't you have to roughly design the arcs way ahead to make sure you don't have an, oh, that scene would have made great sense in that arc? Part of this comes to kind of Doyleist versus Watsonian reasoning, right? Where, from a Watsonian sense, in the case of St. Angel's Feast, it made perfect sense to use the seed of the Brides of Strahd in a arc that already included some vampire spawn. But one of the things that I like to do while I'm tracking the development and growth of seeds throughout a campaign is track when and how they're introduced, and make sure they're like plants being tended to and nurtured on a regular basis. If I see a seed that I haven't touched in a long time, I'm going to go out of my way to artificially inject it into the current chapter or arc. So, part of this thing from Uriel, for example, showing up in Barovia. And obviously this is a bit of an artifice. It's not entirely true in that, the Muriel thing has, I took it from, I found inspiration somewhere else, or actually I forget if I came up with it, but it doesn't matter. But, the idea is that at the beginning of the campaign, if you want to immediately start seeding something before it's obvious, you can just decide arbitrarily, I want to add this campaign element in here. Let's say I wanted to start seeding the druids in St. Angel's Feast, right? They're nowhere near there, right? But if I want to, I could just easily and arbitrarily say, oh, the part of the wood that formed the coffins was infested by tree blights at the time, and so there are some logs that are waiting to be crafted into coffins or something like that. And so when things start getting messy in the coffin maker shop, some twig blights come out and start causing a ruckus. That's a seed. I just added that in randomly. And as the product of 5 seconds of thought and deliberation, is it the best? Probably not. But you could see how this is an example of how nothing matters. Everything is made up. So anytime you want to add a seed in, there's no reason why you can't. You can shove 5 different seeded narrative elements to a single arc with no rhyme or reason whatsoever. You can come up with the reason afterward. The only reason you need is because I want to make this arc more complex and more intricate, and I want to start sowing the seeds now. You don't need any other excuse. Hopefully that answers the question. So, um, that is the end of my fast talking, rambling, meandering diatribe. Hopefully that was helpful and interesting. Just to round off, does anyone have any thoughts or questions?
I would like to add to the stuff about like planting the seeds and such, and that sometimes I'll just let players do it for me. And what I mean by that is I like to ask my players like between sessions, like what were the highlights for you? What were your stars and wishes? I think is the system it's called. Like what were the best parts? What do you want to do next session and stuff? And I'll pay attention to what they find important. And sometimes they'll see connections that don't actually exist, or like they'll place super importance on a really minor NPC and ignore the important NPC. And sometimes I'm like, actually, that would still work for the story going ahead. So we'll just go with whatever you just went with. Well, you clearly want this guy to be important, so we'll make him important. Um, and sometimes that can like smooth things out or be a little easier than correcting a misconception. Um, and so that helps me with some of those small details on filling in like the next spot or getting the planning done, especially running some modules where it is a little easier to kind of move things around. Um, but I think letting players do the work for you sometimes is frees up the mind space a lot.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a really great point. Just seconded. Although obviously, I think that it's just important to be a little caution that you don't want to say yes to everything the players want or think
Oh
of.
no.
But I think you're right that on the margin, DMs could definitely you know afford to err more on the side of following their players instead of following their internal lore.
It's it's helpful to see what they're paying attention to, so then you know if you need to either adjust how you're delivering something, or maybe it is just, yeah, it won't change much if I go with this guy instead, so we'll just go with this guy. Like
Yeah, absolutely agreed.
Yeah, yeah, I usually do ask my players at the start of a session. So, what happened last session? Admittedly, sometimes that's my terrible memory, but it's usually paying attention to what they noticed and didn't notice.
Yeah, I think that's
Perfect.
a great thing. Same here is like I let my players do the summary of last session, and whoever does it will get an inspiration for it. But that way, I get to know what did they write down actually.
That's a good one. Yeah. Cool. And I see a comment in the chat as well about, the difficulty of back to breaking the fourth wall about striking a balance because you don't want to take away the excitement of not knowing what happens next. I think that one thing that might help is, kind of really abstracting the issues and having these conversations from a meta perspective, right? Where, you know, maybe it would spoil too much to ask them hey, do you want to see a campaign an adventure next where Argynvost gets a motorcycle and you know you know assaults Castle Ravenloft with a shotgun? Like, you don't want to go that far, but you can ask them questions like, oh, would you enjoy an adventure that's a little more Rambo style, or do you want something that's a little more Game of Thronesy? And kind of going off those high level vibes, I think, can be helpful in sculpting and structuring your expectations. Um, Obviously, you don't do it all the time, and you want to do your best to kind of read between the lines and to glean insights yourself. But as a general matter, it's not a bad idea to check in every now and again to see how you're doing and seeing what they'd really love to see. And if they say, oh, I don't know, you're doing everything great, then you're good. No need to dig any deeper, at least not verbally.
Yeah, one more thing that I would like to ask out on this seat and arcs and planning out productivity. I had the problem with basically like homebrew or even in Kaiserstadt. There's this really big thing. There's a lot of things to read out and to prepare, and I don't want to miss out on a chance where afterwards I think, oh my god, this would have been a great seat to put in here. If I would have introduced fucking Rick Harvey or anyone right at like last session, that would have been amazing. That would perfect sense, but I forgot because I didn't plan them out or flesh them out enough yet. And I don't want to like, there's the problem with like, I need to flesh out everything enough so that I don't miss on really great chances. On the other side, I don't want to flesh out everything because some of it might go to waste and it's a huge amount of work. Like, where do you balance this?
So I think, ultimately my main response to that is that, and maybe this is just me, and maybe Matt Mercer in his ivory tower would answer differently, but my answer is you're never going to accomplish that. There are always going to be disappointments or mistakes that you make or things that you leave out or things that would have just been great if you'd remembered to include it. Even if, you've done all your due diligence and you've done your best at the time, human brain's capacity for creativity is astounding, and it's entirely possible that even if you'd done your best, there was still no chance of you figuring out that idea until exactly 20 minutes after the session ended while you're standing in the shower. Like, unfortunately, there's not really a foolproof way of doing that. And while you can kind of do your best to kind of keep track of seeds, advance them over time, kind of artificially try to inject them and mix them up, and follow certain templates or methods or algorithms to up the complexity of your adventures, there's not really any foolproof method that I found, at least, that catches all of those missed opportunities and handles them perfectly. Because ultimately, what you're talking about is, zero shot writing, writing something with no examples to go off of. And I don't know about you, but I've yet to find a published author who doesn't edit their work heavily. 2 drafts, 3 drafts, 4. Because as a DM, what you're doing is you're working with your players to write a story functionally on the first try. And so, I mean, if, editing a novel for publication can take at least as much as the original drafting of it. So if you want to double your prep time or more to, edit and revise and iterate on your session plan, you certainly can, which admittedly might, involve throwing out entirely, starting from scratch multiple times, going back to your notes, killing your darlings, etc. Like, you can do that, and that will, on the margins, catch more of those missed opportunities, just as editing does in writing. But at a certain point, I don't know if it's worth it. I personally would prefer to just spend the time making my first draft the best it can be, rather than spending lots more time iterating as much as possible ad infinitum. But that's just me.
Yeah, I believe the same, but it's more about what is that point? Where is that point?
I mean, for me, the way that I approach it is I'm a very lazy person. I offload most of my mental load onto templates and, outlines and things, so that the actual act of prepping a session or even prepping a campaign is honestly not that much. And I kind of just trust. I delegate a lot of my trust and creativity to these systems to ensure that as long as I'm filling up, these molds, as long as I'm putting the pieces down where my past self has told me to put them, it'll be good enough. Will it be a work of art? Probably not. You can always put in more effort if you like. Like any kind of art, detailing, you get out what you put into it. Certainly, if you want to spend 3 hours putting in lots of foreshadowing and lots of little beats and adding as all the details that you like, sure, it might be that much richer for you personally, and if your players are the types to enjoy that sort of thing, then maybe it'll improve their experience. But you've got to, I can't really answer the question because it's something you got to answer for yourself, which is it worth it? Because for me, that level of detailing of world building and lore and intricacy is not worth it. I've done my due diligence. I feel like I've made my seeds, I've made my templates, and if nothing else, I can be very confident that my players will walk away from tonight's session having enjoyed themselves, feeling entertained, and had a good time. Could I go further? Sure. Is it necessary? For me, the answer is no.
Thank you.
Don't know if that helped or not. It might not have been the entirely in the
I don't think
mark.
there's a satisfying answer to this question.
Fair enough.
It's probably also worth keeping in mind that you're the one that is closest to your art, so you are going to know where you are going to have the most chance of being the one to see all the blemishes. A lot of times, there's a lot that your players either won't notice or won't care about. So I so there's a certain point where the you just kind of have to realize that it can't be perfect. But if you're having fun and your players are having fun, well, okay, something to
Yeah,
know for there.
yeah, I think that's a great point, especially because like there are kind of two views of how these things work, right? It's a good point bringing in art because from an artist perspective, you could always be better. You know, there's limitless potential. Literally, it's unbound. And so you're looking at this thing that you're creating that it could be, and you're seeing this limitless scope in all the areas that it could succeed and extend and grow and flourish. Players don't view it that way. Players look at it like a professor grading an exam, maybe. You know, there is not limitless potential. There are A's, B pluses, and sometimes A pluses. But like usually most players will be happy with a B plus. Most will be very happy with an A. And sure, if you spend an extra 50 hours or even 5 hours doing additional detailing and foreshadowing and intricacy, sure, you could take an A to an A plus. But there's not really an A plus plus. And a lot of the time, because of the law of diminishing returns, the work necessary to take something from an A to an A plus is just not necessarily going to be worth the extra enjoyment your players get out of this. Because again, you're creating a product for people to consume, your players. And there's only so much enjoyment that you can wring out of the human brain. Eventually, you do wind up running against those walls. And the only critic that you really still have left to please is yourself. At that point, it's entirely up to you how far you're willing or needing to go to satisfy your own ego. And yeah, like you said, the 80-20 rule in chat, 80% of the gains will come from 20% of the effort. So do you really need to go the last way? Do you need to take it all the way to the finish line? Ultimately, that's something to decide based on how much it matters to you.
I hate these questions with a non-deterministic answer.
It's tough. I
Uh,
mean, yeah, ultimately because a large
Ah.
part of it just does come down to you personally or anyone. All right. Anything
Yeah,
else
but
before we
thank
wrap
you.
up? Oh
Thank
yeah,
you.
what's up?
It was a good information, good discussion. Thank you.
Sure thing. Thanks for bringing it up. It's an important question to ask, and kind of tricky to grapple with for everyone who faces it individually, I guess. So, but still a good one to ask.
It's
All
a
right.
quandary
Yep.
self-help books and every educational institution has struggled with forever.
Yep. Good luck. Worth asking, but good luck finding an answer.
I've got a somewhat an, a short story if you want to hear it about roughly this. I was asking my
Go for it.
players, one of my players, if they ever had the feeling that they have these triggered events, like, oh, Varrock was summoning Winter Splinter just as you came on top of the hill. Coincidence, right? Like if they ever have the feeling of that they walk somewhere and that will trigger it. It was just on time. And if I was thinking about ways to avoid it, to like make sure that it's how do I pace something that Winter Splinter will not be like already summoned 10 minutes before they arrive, or I don't know, take another 7 hours when they arrived. So it will always be this climax on top of Yester Hill or whatever. And because I thought of this as a really big problem. Like, how does it always happen right when we're there? Like from a logic sense. But they just looked at me like, when did that ever happen? I was like, oh, well, that's good to know. And I think that's basically what you said about the player's view and how the DM's view maybe, which can relate to the what we just talked about. Really opened my mind to this.
Yeah, that's a great example. The metrics that you're looking at might not be the metrics your players are looking at, and definitely their perspectives can be very different from yours. Good stuff. All right. I think on that note, I'm going to close up shop for today. So thank you everyone for coming out. Glad/hope you found it helpful and interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was
Thank you.
Great stuff. Great stuff.
Awesome. You all take care, and I'll catch you next time.